The laughter spread across the classroom as Daxton mimicked what he thought deaf speech sounded like. Acacia clutched her notebook tighter, tears forming despite her best efforts. For weeks she had endured the whispers, the stares, the deliberate mumbling when she tried to read lips. As she gathered her books to escape the humiliation, Ms. Marsh suddenly moved to the center of the room. Without speaking a single word, her hands began to flow in perfect, fluid sign language, expressing more eloquence and emotion than most of the students had ever witnessed. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If stories of unexpected compassion and dignity touch your heart, consider subscribing for more moments where courage changes everything in an instant. The chalk scratched precisely against the blackboard as Ms. Elawan Marsh wrote a series of complex chemical equations with practiced efficiency. Her handwriting was immaculate, each symbol perfectly formed, proportions exact, subscripts precisely where they belonged. The sound of chalk on board competed with the shuffling of backpacks and murmured conversations as students filed into advanced chemistry for fourth period. Ms. Marsh didn't turn around as the students entered. At 34, she had been teaching at Westridge High School for 8 years and had established a reputation for brilliant instruction delivered with minimal emotional engagement. Students respected her intelligence and clarity, but few claimed to know her as a person. She maintained a professional distance that bordered on detachment, punctual, prepared, precise, but rarely revealing anything beyond her evident passion for chemistry. "Please take your seats and open your textbooks to page 217, she instructed, without turning from the board, her voice carrying clearly through the classroom, despite its measured tone. "We'll be continuing our discussion of covalent bonding with particular attention to polarization." The students settled into their usual seats, the social hierarchy of high school evident in their distribution around the room. Front center spots were claimed by the academically motivated, side rows by those who preferred to balance attention with occasional disengagement, and back corners by those who viewed chemistry as merely an obligatory credit toward graduation. The classroom door opened one final time as the bell rang, revealing a girl who hesitated momentarily at the threshold. Acacia Novak stood just over 5 feet tall, with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, and eyes that scanned the room with cautious assessment. At 16, she carried herself with the careful composure of someone who had learned to navigate new environments through necessity rather than choice. Most noticeable to the curious glances from her new classmates were the hearing aids visible behind both ears. Sleek, modern devices that nonetheless immediately marked her as different in the ruthlessly conformist world of high school. Acacia approached Ms. Marsh's desk with a yellow slip of paper, the standard transfer student form, along with an additional document on official letterhead. Ms. Marsh turned from the board, taking both papers and reviewing them with the same efficiency she applied to grading lab reports. Her expression remained neutral as she read the accommodation letter detailing Acacia's hearing impairment and the recommended classroom adjustments. "Very well, Ms. Novak," she said, making eye contact briefly before returning to the board. "Find an available seat. We're on page 217. Acacia nodded and turned toward the classroom, scanning the remaining open seats. She moved toward an empty desk in the front row, optimal positioning for lip reading and visual access to instructional materials. Before she could reach it, a backpack landed heavily on the seat. "Save for Lyra," said Daxton Pierce, extending his leg to block the aisle. At 17, Daxton combined academic capability with social dominance. Varsity soccer captain, student council representative, and unofficial arbiter of classroom social dynamics. His calculated smile carried the particular cruelty of someone accustomed to facing no meaningful consequences for his actions. Acacia hesitated only momentarily before redirecting to an open seat along the side wall. Her expression betrayed no reaction, suggesting this wasn't the first time she had navigated such a situation. She settled into the desk, removed her textbook, and positioned herself at an angle to maintain the best possible view of Ms. Marsh's face. "Continuing from yesterday," Ms. Marsh began, "electronegativity differences between atoms determine the polarity of molecular bonds." She turned to write additional formulas on the board, her back now to the class. Acacia shifted in her seat, trying to glimpse Ms. Marsh's face and profile. Without visual access to the teacher's lips, following the lecture became significantly more challenging. She leaned forward, watching for when Ms. Marsh might turn again, while taking meticulous notes of everything written on the board. From across the room, Daxton nudged his friend and nodded toward Acacia's concentrated efforts. He mouthed words silently with exaggerated movements, mimicking what he imagined as speech therapy exercises. A few nearby students stifled laughs. Ms. Marsh turned, noting the disruption with a quick glance but continuing her lecture without comment. For the next section, you'll work in pairs to predict molecular shapes using the VSEPR theory. Find a partner and collect one worksheet per team. The classroom immediately buzzed with activity as students quickly paired with friends. Acacia remained at her desk, watching as the familiar choreography of exclusion played out. Averted eyes, quick pairings before she could approach, the subtle body language that communicated not with the new girl, especially not with the deaf one. After, most students had paired off. Only Acacia and another girl remained unpartnered. Wren Holloway, a quiet junior with an artistic reputation and little interest in chemistry, reluctantly moved her desk beside Acacia's. With dark-rimmed glasses and paint often staining her fingertips, Wren had her own experience with social marginalization, though of a voluntary nature rather than imposed one. "I guess we're working together," Wren said, speaking with unnecessary volume and exaggerated mouth movements. Acacia nodded, pulling out her notebook. She wrote in perfectly formed handwriting. "I can read lips well if you face me directly and speak normally. No need to shout." Wren blinked in surprise, both at the elegant handwriting and the articulate communication. "Oh, sorry," she said, adjusting her volume back to normal. "I haven't really known anyone who's deaf before." Acacia wrote again. "Hard of hearing, not completely deaf. Lost most of my hearing at age 7. I've had time to adapt." As they began working through the molecular structure problems, Wren discovered that Acacia's understanding of chemistry far exceeded her own. Acacia worked methodically through each problem, occasionally writing explanations when Wren looked confused. Her approach was logical and precise, with none of the hesitation Wren felt when confronting the abstract concepts. Across the room, Daxton and his lab partner struggled with the same problems, their frustration mounting as they erased another incorrect answer. Daxton glanced over at Acacia's neat work, his expression souring as he realized she was progressing faster than most of the class. During a momentary lull in the activity, Acacia's mind drifted briefly to memories she usually kept carefully contained. The antiseptic smell of a hospital room, the concerned faces of doctors speaking words she could no longer hear properly, the sensation of sound slowly fading like a radio being turned down, the aftermath of a severe case of bacterial meningitis that had nearly taken her life before taking her hearing instead. She returned her focus to the present as Wren asked her a question about electron pairs. The work provided welcome distraction from both memories and the occasional glances from classmates still assessing the new arrival. As the period neared its end, Ms. Marsh collected the worksheets and assigned reading for the next class. While students packed their materials, Daxton leaned toward his friends, whisper-talking, while looking directly at Acacia. "Must be nice to tune out whenever you want," he said, loud enough for nearby students to hear, but not quite loud enough to warrant teacher intervention. "Wonder if she turns those things off when her parents lecture her." His friends laughed as Ms. Marsh looked up from her desk. "Focus on your work, please," she said, without specific direction, her tone suggesting general classroom management rather than targeted intervention. The bell rang, sending students flowing toward the door. Acacia gathered her materials methodically, waiting until the initial rush subsided before standing to leave. As she exited, she noticed Ms. Marsh watching her with an unreadable expression, one hand absently touching what appeared to be an antique pocket watch hanging from a thin chain around her neck. 2 weeks later, the chemistry lab hummed with activity as students conducted experiments in pairs. The room smelled of chemicals and Bunsen burner gas, with the occasional waft of singed eyebrow when someone adjusted a flame incorrectly. Ms. Marsh moved efficiently between stations, checking progress and occasionally correcting technique with minimal words. Acacia and Wren had developed an effective, if not particularly warm, working relationship. Their current experiment, measuring reaction rates at different temperatures, was progressing well ahead of schedule. Acacia's methodical approach to measurement and data collection complemented Wren's more intuitive grasp of variables, resulting in consistently solid results. "Your measurements are always exact," Wren commented as Acacia recorded another perfect data point. "Mine are always a little off," Acacia wrote on her notepad, I rely on visual precision more since I can't hear subtle changes in reactions. You hear the bubbling getting faster? I watch for it. Wren considered this perspective she'd never contemplated before. That actually makes sense. Different inputs, different adaptations. Across the lab, Daxton's team struggled with their experiment. Their reaction wasn't progressing as expected. Their measurements were inconsistent, and their frustration was mounting. Daxton's usual confidence had deteriorated into visible aggravation as he watched other groups, particularly Acacia's, recording successful results. When Ms. Marsh stepped out briefly to retrieve additional materials from the prep room, Daxton seized the opportunity. He approached Acacia's station with the casual entitlement of someone accustomed to moving through the world without resistance. Hey, deaf girl, he said, intentionally speaking while standing slightly behind her where she couldn't see his lips. When she didn't respond, he reached past her and deliberately knocked over a beaker of their solution. The non-toxic liquid spread across their data sheet and dripped onto Acacia's notebook. Sorry, Daxton said with exaggerated innocence as Acacia turned in surprise. Didn't know you couldn't hear me coming. Maybe they should put a bell on me. His friends across the room laughed appreciatively at the performance. Acacia's expression flickered briefly with hurt before settling back into composed neutrality. She reached for paper towels and began cleaning up the spill with the efficiency of someone who had handled many such accidents before. Wren stood awkwardly nearby, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to directly challenge Daxton's social position by defending her lab partner. Ms. Marsh returned to find Acacia mopping up the last of the liquid. Her gaze moved from the wet papers to Daxton, who had already retreated to his station, to Acacia's carefully neutral expression. Instead of addressing Daxton directly, she simply retrieved fresh paper towels and helped complete the cleanup. You'll need to restart this trial, she said to Acacia and Wren. There should be enough time remaining if you work efficiently. As Ms. Marsh moved away, Acacia and Wren exchanged a glance that acknowledged the injustice without directly addressing it, the universal language of those who understand that some battles aren't worth fighting, at least not in that moment. They reset their experiment with practiced movements, neither speaking about what had happened. Acacia's hands moved with particular precision, her focus intense as if the careful measurement of chemicals could somehow restore balance to a situation beyond her control. When the lab period ended, Ms. Marsh called for attention over the noise of cleaning glassware and closing textbooks. Your formal presentations will begin next week, she announced. Each pair will present their experimental findings with particular attention to methodology and error analysis. This presentation constitutes 30% of your semester grade. Acacia's shoulders tensed slightly at the announcement. While her written work consistently received top marks, oral presentations posed particular challenges. Most teachers at her previous schools had allowed alternative assessment methods, written reports, or pre-recorded presentations with captions. Each team member must participate equally in the verbal presentation, Ms. Marsh continued, her gaze sweeping across the room but lingering momentarily on Acacia. Detailed requirements are outlined in the rubric being distributed now. As students filtered out after the bell, Acacia remained behind, carefully formulating what she needed to communicate. She approached Ms. Marsh's desk with her notebook, where she had written a polite request for accommodation, perhaps a written component that could substitute for the verbal presentation requirement. Ms. Marsh read the note, her expression remaining neutral. As she considered the request, Acacia noticed something she hadn't observed before. The teacher's hands, resting briefly on the desk, showed slight calluses on the fingertips, and a particular musculature along the metacarpals, physical characteristics inconsistent with someone who primarily wrote on boards and typed on computers. These were the hands of someone who regularly performed repetitive fine motor movements requiring significant dexterity and strength. Before Acacia could process this observation, Ms. Marsh responded verbally. Everyone presents according to the same requirements, Ms. Novak. I'm sure you'll manage. She turned her attention back to her computer, effectively dismissing Acacia without further discussion. From near the doorway, Daxton had lingered just long enough to overhear the exchange. He smirked at Acacia as she walked past him into the hallway, whispering to his waiting friends about the upcoming presentation. This should be entertaining. Think she'll sound like Frankenstein's monster? Acacia continued walking, her face betraying nothing, as she navigated the crowded hallway. But beneath her composed exterior, anxiety and resignation competed for dominance. Another school, another set of challenges, another group of peers who saw her difference before they saw her. The constant work of proving herself worthy of basic respect had grown exhausting, yet she had no choice but to continue. The library at Westridge High School maintained the hushed reverence of academic spaces everywhere, despite the occasional whispers and suppressed laughter of students who viewed it more as social refuge than scholarly sanctuary. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above shelves of worn textbooks and outdated encyclopedias. Acacia sat alone at a corner table, surrounded by chemistry references, methodically organizing note cards for her upcoming presentation. Her research was thorough, her analysis precise. The academic content posed no challenge. It was the delivery that filled her with quiet dread. Her previous speech therapist had helped her maintain clear enough vocalization for basic communication, but public speaking amplified every challenge she faced: modulation, pacing, inflection, all the elements that depended on being able to hear oneself. Movement near the library entrance caught her attention. Ms. Marsh had entered and was speaking with the school counselor, Ms. Zinnia Valdez, a compassionate woman in her mid-40s, known for her fierce advocacy for students with special needs. Their conversation appeared intense, with Zinnia gesturing emphatically toward a manila folder that Acacia recognized as the type used for student files, possibly her own. Acacia shifted her position slightly, maintaining a casual appearance while trying to observe the interaction. Ms. Marsh's typically composed demeanor had slipped, revealing an emotional intensity that seemed out of character for the reserved chemistry teacher. At one point, Ms. Marsh's hand moved to the antique pocket watch she always wore, fingers tracing its surface in what appeared to be an unconscious gesture of self-soothing. Curiosity overcoming caution, Acacia stood and moved toward the reference section closest to the two women, pretending to search for a book while attempting to position herself within lip-reading range. Before she could get close enough to discern any words, both women noticed her approach. Their conversation halted abruptly, with Ms. Marsh quickly composing her features into their usual professional neutrality. "Ms. Novak," she acknowledged with a slight nod, "finding everything you need for your research?" Acacia nodded, holding up a chemistry journal as explanation for her proximity. "Good. I look forward to seeing your presentation next week." Ms. Marsh turned back to Zinnia, saying something too low and quick for Acacia to catch before both women moved toward the exit, effectively ending any chance of discovering what had prompted such an uncharacteristic display of emotion from her typically detached teacher. Later that afternoon, Acacia navigated the crowded hallway between classes, keeping her gaze forward while maintaining awareness of her surroundings through peripheral vision, a skill developed through years of compensating for auditory limitations. She couldn't hear approaching footsteps or whispered comments, but she had learned to read the subtle shifts in crowd dynamics that often signaled trouble. A group of Daxton's friends approached from the opposite direction, their expressions telegraphing their intentions before they reached her. As they passed, they began making exaggerated mouth movements, faces contorted in silent, mocking pantomimes of what they imagined sign language to be. Their hands flapped nonsensically, deliberately crude and ignorant approximations of the sophisticated communication system they were mocking. Acacia continued walking, her pace steady, her expression unchanged. Inside, humiliation burned alongside resignation. This particular form of mockery was nothing new, just another verse in a familiar song she had endured at every school since losing her hearing. From several lockers down, Wren witnessed the display. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded hallway. Wren's expression flashed with something like sympathy, or perhaps guilt, but she quickly looked away, busying herself with books in her locker rather than acknowledging what she had seen. The chemistry project had created a tentative connection between them, but not one strong enough to risk social capital by publicly objecting to Daxton's group's behavior. Seeking a moment of privacy, Acacia pushed open the door to the girls' bathroom. Inside a stall, she found momentary refuge from watchful eyes. The isolation was both burden and blessing. No one to mock her, but also no one to truly see her beyond the single characteristic that seemed to define her entire identity in others' eyes. When she emerged from the stall, she found a crude drawing taped to the bathroom mirror, a cartoonish figure with enormous hearing aids and a speech bubble filled with gibberish. The artistic style was recognizable as Daxton's. His caricatures of teachers and students were well known throughout the school. Acacia removed the drawing with steady hands, crumpling it before dropping it into the trash. She leaned toward the mirror, using the moment of privacy to practice the expression she would wear for the rest of the day. Composed, unbothered, dignified. It was a mask she had perfected over years of similar incidents, a necessary armor for navigating a world that too often viewed her difference as entertainment rather than simply another way of being human. Presentation day arrived with the particular tension that accompanies high-stakes academic assessment. The chemistry classroom had been rearranged to accommodate the formal atmosphere, with student desks forming a semicircle around a cleared presentation space at the front. Ms. Marsh sat at her desk, evaluation rubrics stacked neatly before her, her expression offering no hint of either encouragement or concern. Each team delivered their presentations in turn, explaining experimental methods and findings with varying degrees of confidence and clarity. Ms. Marsh's evaluation remained inscrutable, her only feedback consisting of occasional questions designed to test the depth of students' understanding. When it came time for Acacia and Wren's presentation, they moved to the front of the room with their carefully prepared visual aids. As agreed, Wren would handle the introduction and methodology sections, while Acacia would explain their results and conclusions. They had practice during lunch periods, with Acacia working diligently to ensure her speech would be as clear as possible, despite her inability to hear her own voice perfectly. Wren completed her portion competently, if not brilliantly, yielding the floor to Acacia with a supportive nod. Acacia began her explanation, speaking carefully while referencing the data charts they had prepared. Her speech was deliberate, with the slightly flattened intonation common among those who cannot hear themselves fully. But her content was exceptionally well organized and scientifically sound. From his seat near the back, Daxton seized the opportunity during the question period. He raised his hand and, when acknowledged, launched into a deliberately complex, rapid-fire question about potential experimental errors, speaking quickly while partially covering his mouth with his hand, effectively preventing Acacia from reading his lips properly. "I'm sorry," Acacia said, her voice carefully modulated. "Could you repeat that more slowly, please?" "I said," Daxton repeated with exaggerated slowness now, drawing snickers from several classmates, "wouldn't variation in ambient temperature affect your results? Or were you unable to hear the equipment functioning improperly?" The unnecessary reference to hearing made his intent clear. Miss Marsh watched from her desk, her expression unchanged, making no move to intervene. Acacia took a breath and responded with dignity. "We controlled for ambient temperature variations by using a calibrated thermometer and recording environmental conditions throughout the experiment. All equipment was visually monitored for proper function." Her pronunciation of several technical terms was slightly imprecise, prompting whispers and poorly concealed smirks from Daxton's friends. Wren shifted uncomfortably beside her, but offered no support. They completed their presentation and returned to their seats, receiving a polite but reserved acknowledgement from Ms. Marsh. Acacia maintained her composed expression, despite the flush of embarrassment warming her face. Years of similar situations had taught her that visible reaction only encouraged further targeting. The final presentation came from Daxton and his partner. Their project had struggled with consistency issues, but Daxton's confident delivery and charismatic presence effectively masked the scientific weaknesses in their work. Throughout their presentation, he incorporated subtle jokes and references that, while seemingly about chemistry, contained veiled mockery of Acacia's speech patterns and communication challenges. Most students laughed along, either not recognizing the targeted nature of the humor or choosing to ignore it. Ms. Marsh observed without comment, her evaluation revealing nothing about her thoughts regarding the inappropriate undercurrent. As their presentation concluded, Daxton addressed the class directly. "In conclusion, our experiment demonstrated how different elements interact under pressure. Speaking of which, I have a question for our resident expert on adaptation." He turned toward Acacia, his expression a perfect mask of academic curiosity. "Wouldn't you agree that certain defects make organisms less viable in natural selection?" The question hung in the air, its cruel intent thinly veiled behind scientific terminology. The classroom fell uncomfortably silent, the line between academic discussion and targeted bullying now clearly crossed. Even students who had laughed at earlier jokes looked down at their desks, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Beside Acacia, Wren stared fixedly at her notebook, her discomfort evident, but her silence equally so. No one spoke up, no one objected to the inappropriate question or its obvious subtext. Ms. Marsh's gaze moved between Daxton's challenging smirk and Acacia's composed face. For a moment, something flickered in the teacher's typically unreadable expression. Perhaps anger, perhaps recognition, perhaps decision. Acacia, who had endured similar moments countless times before, began gathering her books with deliberate movements. She had learned that strategic retreat often prevented escalation, allowing tensions to dissipate before returning with dignity intact. Despite her best efforts, tears formed at the corners of her eyes, not from the cruelty itself, which was familiar enough, but from the exhaustion of facing it yet again in yet another school that had promised to be different. As she stood to leave the classroom, dignity wrapped around her like a protective cloak. Despite her burning eyes, the atmosphere shifted. Ms. Marsh, who had remained seated throughout all previous presentations and discussions, suddenly stood and moved to the center of the room. Her movement was so unexpected that every student's attention immediately focused on her. Acacia paused near the door, uncertain what was happening. Ms. Marsh stood perfectly still for a moment, her eyes meeting Acacia's across the classroom. Then, without speaking a single word aloud, Ms. Marsh's hands began to move. Her fingers, wrists, and arms flowed through a series of precise, fluid movements that transformed the space between them into something almost tangible. This wasn't the crude mimicry Daxton's friends had performed in the hallway. These were the practiced, eloquent movements of American Sign Language executed with native-like fluency. Communication as beautiful as it was unexpected. Acacia froze, her books clutched against her chest, as she watched her chemistry teacher signing with a proficiency that spoke of years of practice and deep familiarity with the language's nuances and expressions. The message forming in the air between them was clear to Acacia while remaining a mystery to everyone else in the room. Ms. Novak, you're not required to respond to inappropriate questions. Your research demonstrates more scientific understanding than what we've just heard. The classroom fell into absolute silence as students watched in confusion and growing realization. Daxton's smirk had vanished, replaced by uncertainty as he witnessed an exchange he couldn't understand, but could clearly recognize as significant. Acacia's hands trembled slightly as she lowered her books and responded with her own signs. Movements rusty from disuse at school, but flowing more naturally than her spoken words ever could. Why did you wait? They've been mocking me for weeks while you watched. Their exchange continued, hands moving rapidly in a conversation too quick and complex for anyone else in the room to follow, even if they had understood the language. Emotion colored their signing, Acacia's movements sharp with weeks of contained hurt and frustration. Ms. Marsh is flowing with unexpected gentleness and something that looked remarkably like regret. Ms. Marsh signed, I apologize for waiting to reveal this. Sometimes allowing people to show their true character teaches more than any intervention. Acacia's responding signs challenged this reasoning, her movements expressing the isolation and pain of being used as an unwitting object lesson. Ms. Marsh acknowledged this with a nod that conveyed genuine respect rather than mere acknowledgement. The students watched in stunned silence, witnessing a transformation in both their teacher and their perception of the new student. The girl they had dismissed as disabled was communicating with sophisticated fluency in a language none of them understood, while the teacher they had known as emotionally distant was engaging with expressive animation they had never witnessed before. Without breaking eye contact with Acacia, Ms. Marsh reached for the antique pocket watch she always wore. She opened it, revealing not a timepiece, but a small photograph of a young woman in a hospital bed, her hands positioned in what was clearly sign language, communicating with a much younger version of Ms. Marsh visible at the edge of the image. The chemistry teacher turned to address the class verbally for the first time since beginning the signed exchange. My sister Arwen was deaf. Before she died from the same illness that took Acacia's hearing, she taught me that language transcends sound. How we communicate reveals our character, not our limitations. Daxton's expression had transformed from mockery to genuine shame as the full impact of his behavior became clear. Other students shifted uncomfortably, their previous laughter now sitting heavy in the newly reconfigured social dynamic of the classroom. Ms. Marsh continued, her voice carrying an emotional weight absent from all her previous lectures. In this classroom, we believe in evidence. The evidence shows Ms. Novak has contributed more intellectual value than those who wasted energy mocking what they don't understand. She turned back to Acacia, switching between sign and spoken language so that the entire class could follow. Language takes many forms. Intelligence takes many forms. Those who cannot recognize this demonstrate only their own limitations, not yours. The revelation of Ms. Marsh's fluency in sign language transformed the chemistry classroom instantly. Students who had been slouching in their seats now sat upright, their attention captured by the unexpected display of connection between their typically reserved teacher and the deaf student they had so casually dismissed. The atmosphere shifted from one of mockery to something approaching reverence as Ms. Marsh continued signing while speaking aloud. "Today we've witnessed more than chemistry experiments," she said, her hands flowing in synchronized ASL. "We've seen how quickly assumptions dissolve when confronted with new information." She surveyed the classroom, her gaze lingering briefly on Daxton, who now studied his desk with uncomfortable intensity. "Science teaches us to revise our hypotheses when evidence contradicts our expectations. Perhaps that principle extends beyond the laboratory." Ms. Marsh moved toward the center of the room, continuing to sign as she spoke. "Many of you have spent weeks forming conclusions about Ms. Novak based on a single characteristic. You observed one aspect of her experience and constructed an entire identity around it. That's not science, that's prejudice. And in this classroom, we value evidence over assumption." Acacia remained near the doorway, her hands still raised in mid-sign, her expression a complex mixture of validation and lingering hurt. For weeks, she had navigated the isolation of being misunderstood and underestimated, only to discover that someone capable of genuine communication had been present but silent all along. With deliberate movements, Ms. Marsh reached into her desk drawer and retrieved a stack of materials. "For our next unit on biochemistry, we'll be studying communication and pathways. I believe some contextual understanding would be valuable." She distributed handouts showing the ASL alphabet. "Today we begin with two essential phrases." She demonstrated the signs for "I'm sorry" and "thank you," guiding the class through proper hand positions and movements. Even Daxton participated, his typical bravado subdued into awkward compliance. The simple lesson created a bridge between worlds that had seemed impossibly distant just minutes before. As the bell rang signaling the end of the period, students gathered their materials slowly, the usual rush for the door replaced by subdued reflection. Several glanced toward Acacia with new eyes, seeing beyond her hearing aids to recognize a person whose experience they had never bothered to imagine. When the classroom had emptied except for Acacia and Ms. Marsh, the silence between them held the weight of unasked questions and unexpressed emotions. Acacia's hands moved first, signing with the fluidity that came from years of relying on this form of expression. "Why didn't you tell me you could sign? These weeks have been so lonely." Ms. Marsh's response combined both sign and speech, as if reconciling her two classroom identities. "I've spent years keeping my personal connection to the deaf community private. After Arwen died, signing became something too painful to share casually." Her hands moved to the pocket watch, opening it to reveal the photograph more clearly. She was 19 when this was taken, already in the final stages of the illness. Bacterial meningitis. Acacia's eyes widened in recognition. "The same thing that caused my hearing loss." "When Ms. Valdez showed me your medical history, I recognized the pattern immediately, but I couldn't bring myself to connect our experiences. It felt too personal, too close to grief I've worked hard to contain." Ms. Marsh's signing became more fluid, more natural than her spoken words. "I convinced myself that maintaining professional distance was the right approach. I was wrong, and you suffered from my hesitation." "You could have stopped them," Acacia signed, her movements conveying the hurt that proper words couldn't fully express. "Every joke, every imitation, every time they pretended to sign nonsense, you saw it all and said nothing. I believed that intervention would only drive their behavior underground, not change it." Ms. Marsh's expression reflected genuine regret, I wanted them to reveal their true characters so they could recognize their own failings. But I failed to consider the cost to you of being the instrument of that lesson. For several moments, they communicated in the silent language that connected them across their different experiences, teacher and student, hearing and deaf, but both understanding the unique grief of navigating a world that often failed to accommodate difference. Your sister, Acacia signed, gesturing toward the photograph. Tell me about her. Miss Marsh's hands formed the name sign for Arwen, a personalized gesture that combined the letter A with the sign for poet in a flowing motion near the heart. She was studying literature when she got sick, brilliant, passionate about language in all its forms. She taught me to sign so we could still talk during her final months, when speaking became too difficult. The conversation that followed bridged more than language differences. It connected two people who had each been carrying private burdens of isolation, one from disability, one from grief, and offered both a path towards something new. 1 month later, the school gymnasium had been transformed for the annual science fair. Folding tables lined the perimeter, each covered with student projects, displaying everything from volcanic eruptions to bacterial cultures to computer models of environmental systems. Parents and judges moved between displays, clipboards in hand, while students nervously explained their research and findings. Near the center of the room, Acacia and Ren stood beside their project, an innovative system combining chemistry principles with assistive technology for the deaf community. Their display featured a prototype device that translated sound vibrations into visual patterns, allowing deaf users to see music, ambient noise levels, and approaching footsteps through a small wearable interface. The dynamic between the two girls had evolved significantly over the past month. Where Ren had once been a reluctant partner, assigned by circumstance, she now exhibited genuine enthusiasm for their collaboration. She had spent weeks learning basic ASL, practicing diligently to communicate with Acacia in her preferred language while helping develop their project. Across the gymnasium, Daxton maintained a respectful distance. The social landscape had shifted dramatically following Ms. Marsh's revelation. While he hadn't been formally punished for his behavior, the public exposure of his cruelty had damaged his carefully cultivated image more effectively than any administrative sanction could have. Several of his former friends had distanced themselves, uncomfortable with their association with behavior that now seemed obviously inappropriate rather than cleverly amusing. Ms. Marsh moved between the science fair projects, her evaluation clipboard in hand, but her demeanor noticeably different from the reserved teacher who had begun the semester. She engaged warmly with students, asking thoughtful questions about their research and offering specific encouragement. The pocket watch still hung around her neck, but now she wore it as a visible connection to her past, rather than a hidden reminder of private grief. When the judges approached Acacia and Ren's table, Acacia did something she hadn't attempted in a public setting since her early days of speech therapy. She delivered their entire presentation in sign language, her hands moving with confident precision as she explained the chemical principles behind their vibration sensing technology. Beside her, Ren provided voiced interpretation, the two working in perfect synchronization to bridge communication for their audience. The lead judge, a professor from the local university, watched with evident appreciation. The practical application of chemical principles to assistive technology is impressive, he commented, but equally notable is the communication methodology you're demonstrating. This is truly interdisciplinary work. After the judges moved to the next project, Daxton approached their table alone. His typical swagger had been replaced by an awkward hesitance, his hands fidgeting at his sides as he gathered his courage. "Your project is really cool," he said, making careful eye contact with Acacia to ensure she could read his lips. Then, with evident practice and concentration, he formed his hands into the sign for "I'm sorry," followed by a somewhat clumsy but recognizable attempt at impressive work. The signs were imperfect, clearly the result of private practice rather than formal instruction, but the effort behind them spoke volumes. Acacia studied him for a moment, measuring his sincerity against weeks of mockery. Without warmth, but with dignified acknowledgement, she signed "thank you" in return. It wasn't forgiveness, that would require more than a single gesture of contrition, but it was recognition of effort, of the possibility that people could learn and change when confronted with the consequences of their actions. As the science fair concluded, Ms. Marsh and Acacia found a quiet moment away from the crowds. They had developed a routine of brief conversations in ASL between classes, building a mentoring relationship that benefited them both. Acacia had found an advocate who truly understood her experience, while Ms. Marsh had rediscovered the joy of the language that had once connected her to her sister. "I never thought I'd sign regularly again after Arwen died," Ms. Marsh confessed, her hands moving in the fluid patterns that had become increasingly natural in recent weeks. "It felt like closing a door that was too painful to keep open." "And now?" Acacia asked, her own signing reflecting the growing confidence she had developed since finding someone who could truly communicate with her. "Now I remember that doors are meant to connect spaces, not just seal them off." Ms. Marsh smiled, a genuine expression that still looked somewhat unfamiliar on her typically composed features. "Arwen would have loved meeting you. She always said that loss creates space for new connections if we're brave enough to allow them." By the end of the school year, Ms. Marsh's classroom had transformed in both physical arrangement and atmosphere. Visual aids now complemented verbal instruction, videos included closed captioning, and seating was configured to optimize sightlines for lip reading. These changes, initially implemented for Acacia's benefit, had improved comprehension for many students who processed information differently. Perhaps most significantly, a small group of students now regularly use basic ASL, integrating signs into their daily communication. What had begun as a moment of revelation had evolved into an ongoing exploration of language and accessibility that extended beyond Acacia's immediate needs. During their final class discussion, the conversation turned unexpectedly personal when a student asked Acacia a question that most had wondered but none had voiced directly. "Do you ever wish you could hear again? Like, if there was a surgery or something that could fix it?" The classroom fell quiet, students uncomfortable with the directness of the question, but curious about the answer. In previous months, such personal inquiry would have felt invasive, but the evolved classroom dynamic had created space for authentic exchange. Acacia considered the question thoughtfully before responding, using both sign and her own voice. "I don't experience silence as emptiness. My world isn't lacking sound. It's filled with visual information that many hearing people miss because they're distracted by noise. I notice facial micro-expressions, body language, patterns of movement that tell me as much as words ever could." She continued, her signing flowing more naturally than her speech, but both conveying her perspective with clarity. "Being deaf isn't something broken that needs fixing. It's just a different way of experiencing the world. Would I accept hearing if offered? Maybe. But I wouldn't consider myself incomplete without it." Ms. Marsh built on Acacia's response, addressing the class while signing simultaneously, a practice that had become her standard teaching approach. Different perspectives aren't deficiencies, they're opportunities for unique insight. Science progresses when we consider phenomena from multiple viewpoints, not when we insist on a single, correct way of perceiving. The semester culminated with a school assembly, showcasing innovative student projects. The chemistry class had prepared a demonstration illustrating molecular bond formation through a combination of chemical reactions and interpretive movement. In a reversal of their early partnership dynamic, Acacia led the explanation using ASL, while Ren provided verbal interpretation for the audience. When the principal introduced the presentation as a special accommodation for our hearing-impaired student, Ms. Marsh politely but firmly corrected him. "This isn't accommodation. It's education," she explained to the assembled students and faculty. The students learning sign language have gained a skill and perspective they'd otherwise miss. Accessibility isn't about charity. It's about recognizing that human experience takes many forms, all equally valid and valuable. After the assembly, Ms. Marsh returned to her classroom to prepare for final exams. On her desk sat her pocket watch, now displayed in a small stand rather than hidden away on a chain. Beside the photograph of Arwen, she had placed a new image, the ASL club that had formed spontaneously following her revelation. Students gathered around Acacia as she taught them to communicate in her language. The two photographs represented different chapters of the same story: how loss can lead to discovery, how difference can create connection rather than division when approached with openness instead of fear. What had begun as a moment of standing up for a single student had expanded into a movement that transformed classroom culture beyond anyone's expectations. As students filed in for their final chemistry session, the atmosphere reflected this transformation. Conversations flowed in multiple modalities: spoken words, signed phrases, written notes, and the universal languages of facial expression and gesture. The communication wasn't perfect, but it was authentic and inclusive in a way that traditional classroom interaction rarely achieved. For their final assignment, Ms. Marsh had asked students to write about a chemical principle that applied to human interaction. Acacia's essay, which she had asked to deliver as a signed presentation with voiced interpretation, explored the concept of catalysis, how the presence of a catalyst allows reactions to occur that might otherwise remain dormant. A catalyst doesn't create the potential for reaction, she explained, her hands forming elegant shapes in the air while Wren voiced her words. It simply reduces the activation energy required, making possible what already wanted to happen. When Ms. Marsh revealed her ability to sign, she didn't create acceptance or understanding out of nothing. She simply lowered the barriers that prevented us from seeing each other clearly. As the school year concluded, both Acacia and Ms. Marsh had been transformed by their unexpected connection. Acacia had discovered that she could maintain her identity as a deaf person while still building meaningful relationships in the hearing world. Ms. Marsh had found that opening the door to her past grief had not diminished her, but expanded her capacity for connection and authentic teaching. The classroom that had once been characterized by casual cruelty and indifference had become a space where difference was not merely tolerated, but actively valued as a source of strength and insight. The chemistry they had studied together, the bonds that form between elements, the catalysts that facilitate transformation, the new compounds that emerge from seemingly simple ingredients, had proven to be not just academic principles but metaphors for their shared journey. Language, they had discovered together, wasn't just in what was spoken or signed or written. It existed in the willingness to reach across difference, to make the effort to understand and be understood. In that reaching, both teacher and student had found something they hadn't known they were seeking, not just communication, but genuine connection that transcended the boundaries of sound and silence.